Welcome to Republican Roundtable. I'm your host, Max Reimer. Today we have in studio a friend of the show. We have the chairman of the Minnesota Gun Owners Caucus, Bryan Strawser.
Hey, Max.
Bryan, thank you for joining the
course,
Republican
happy to be here.
Roundtable. We're going to talk about guns today.
I'm shocked we were talking about guns with me.
Yeah, we could talk about the New England Patriots.
Absolutely. I'm wearing a Patriots shirt under this shirt.
You weren't supposed to. We won't hold that against you, even though your dominance and their dominance every year is ridiculous. Talking about guns, we are just kind of getting over this tragedy that happened, oh my goodness, just last week in New Zealand, Christchurch. We had some mosques that were attacked by a guy who would consider himself to be a white supremacist. He brought a full arsenal to the mosque, and then he filmed himself shooting a bunch of the worshipers at the mosque. I'm wondering, we've seen a lot of rhetoric spin out from that event. How do you as a gun rights activist and how do we as a state or as a party react to an event like that and talk about an event like that?
Well, I mean, I think we should be realistic about what has happened in New Zealand. This was a terroristic act by a guy who, if you look at his manifesto, clearly had a lot of hate in his heart for people of the Muslim faith and probably others. I mean, his manifesto was quite clear that he'd planned this for almost 2 years and went in with a very deliberate attempt to, he intended to kill a lot of people, knew that there probably wouldn't be much resistance in doing so. And he had some political goals that he had articulated in that manifesto, one of which was to create conflict in the United States over the Second Amendment and try to further the chasm around gun rights versus gun control.
One of the fallouts that has come from that event specifically is New Zealand is now calling for legislation to basically take all, I think, semi-automatic firearms, either in a buyback or a collection program, and destroy them, similar to what had happened in Australia a number of decades ago. We see in Minnesota now a lot of activists who are saying, well, if they can do it, why can't we?
Right.
How do you even react to a solution like that?
Well, I mean, I think there's a couple things. The first is just from a constitutional perspective. Countries like New Zealand and Australia and the United Kingdom, which did this about 30 years ago, don't have the same constitutional republic form of government that we do here in the United States. There actually isn't a constitution in New Zealand. So what you see is the government has the ability to take individual rights. And it's not just the area of gun rights. I mean, the idea of government surveillance in the Commonwealth countries versus what we expect here in the United States in terms of privacy are completely night and day different. But yeah, I mean, in the Commonwealth countries like New Zealand, all the government has to do is pass legislation banning a certain type of firearm, and there's really no recourse. There's not a court case, there's not a constitution to appeal to. So I think it's important to kind of delineate that there's some pretty big differences in how our governments are set up. But yeah, certainly we've seen gun control groups here in Minnesota and across the country. The Brady Campaign, Protect Minnesota, both organizations that operate in the state and nationally have already said, well, why can't we do what New Zealand is doing?
Right.
And clearly laws of that nature are not going to be constitutional here in the United States, but I don't think that would stop them from trying.
But philosophically, and that is what they're trying to appeal to, is some kind of emotional, philosophical view on firearms, either within the Constitution or beyond the Constitution. Statistically, why doesn't that solution work? Why doesn't a ban on guns in any form or fashion work?
Well, I think, so a lot of gun control folks, and even Hillary Clinton, when she was running for president, brought up the example of Australia. So Australia had a mass shooting in the late 1990s, and in response to that, banned most handguns and semi-automatic rifles. And they did it through a big buyback program. It's very similar to the approach that New Zealand has outlined.
Yes.
And a lot of folks will hold up that Australia example and say, well, look at how the crime rate and suicide rate have dropped.
And it did, right?
And it did. Yeah, no doubt. It did. It didn't happen because of the gun ban, because if you look just a few hundred miles away in New Zealand, at least until this most recent tragedy, their crime rate and suicide rate also dropped in almost the same amount and manner in a drop of rate that Australia saw, but New Zealand passed none of those gun control bills.
Yes.
So it's really tough to say. I think it's impossible to say the gun ban led to this drop.
Right.
The data might correlate, but it doesn't. It's hard to say that that's what caused it.
Because in that situation, similarly, the amount of gun violence went down in America during the same period, if I recall
Correct.
a statistical comparison correctly.
Correct. I mean, the rate of homicide involving firearms in the United States is half of what it was 25 to 30 years ago. And there's been an even sharper decline in armed robberies, assaults involving firearms. Any other firearms crime has dropped pretty significantly over the last 25 to 30 years.
So, in general, right, and you wouldn't think that the world has gotten less violent or the West has gotten less violent just because of the media coverage that these events tend to get. How do you convey an emotional appeal to people who are obviously emotional about the subject, but still try to paint this picture like, hey, look at how much it's improved. You know, even in the United States, how much gun violence has decreased. Is there a way that you guys, specifically the Gun Owners Caucus, talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, usually what we try to do is just change the conversation. I don't mean to avoid the topic. I mean, change the conversation to, rather than turn into a statistical war of the two different sides, I mean, I like to just ask the question, what's the problem that you're trying to solve? I mean, what do you really want to go after?
Yes.
And so right now, folks, what most activists are going to say, or what most folks concerned about this issue will say is, well, I want schools to be safer. Okay, great. Let's talk about how to make schools safer. If you look at the kind of societal level crime issues, we will also hear, well, I want to see less gun violence, less violence involving firearms. Great, so do we. Let's talk about how to achieve that with strategies that we know work, not this very partisan-driven gun control initiative that they might be supporting that day.
I feel like you are starting to see the modern left, though, become more bold in the way that they approach those conversations, where you lead them down the path, right, to say that, hey, we want to ban all guns. Well, okay, you sound foolish when you say that. But I think more and more people on the left are comfortable with that sentiment. So do you find that those people are like gaining a broader appeal, or is it just that their voice is getting louder?
I think they're louder than they were before. I mean, I think you're right to say that they're somewhat emboldened from where they were. I think that the Parkland students probably have had a lot to do with that. They were very direct and blunt in what they were pushing for politically related to gun control. And I think that probably has emboldened and given some energy to the gun control movement in the United States that wasn't there. They're the only thing you hear the Minnesota DFL talk about when it comes to gun control. It's about school safety, and they'll talk about Parkland.
Right.
So I think that's added energy to the gun control movement, and they've had a little success in some states where either there's a Democratic control, and so there's not much resistance to that agenda, or it's Florida where the Republicans there was no way the Florida Republicans are going to be able to stand in the way of that juggernaut.
Right, right. To that end, school safety is how a lot of, proposed legislation, but then also just rhetoric and fundraising and things of that nature that these groups do. School safety is what is the banner that they're carrying right now. Again, even in many cases, school gun violence has gone down, or actual murders that are happening in our school systems across the nation. But what are tangible solutions that you guys provide or suggest for things like school safety? How do you counter that specific argument?
Well, I think so. The question becomes what makes schools safer. So does passing universal background checks make a school safer? Well, if you look at the data on recent school shootings, no. I mean, the perpetrators in those acts acquired their firearms either legally or they stole them. Neither of which are going to be affected by red flag laws and universal background check laws. Even if you look at the Parkland situation with that individual who had 37 plus contacts with law enforcement, even though Florida didn't have a red flag law, they didn't take advantage of any of the other laws they had in place to arrest him, charge him with a crime, put him on a 72-hour hold, their equivalent of that. So one is, I think, to kind of to steer the conversation away from some of those solutions towards things that work. And we know that things that work are school threat assessment teams, where you have interdisciplinary groups within the school that work to identify kids that are at risk, and then work to make sure those kids have the resources they need, or that the school takes the right actions to ensure safety. It's security audits of the school to identify where there might be physical security opportunities, access control opportunities. And then lastly, I think it's, are there ways that the schools need to be hardened in order to alleviate some of those concerns? And then what's the access to student counseling and mental health resources, particularly in greater Minnesota, where that's a big opportunity?
Within that, we had talked prior to this conversation, and I want to go back to the New Zealand subject, but it's also schools, I think, need to become a harder target, and then also kind of our places of worship. I think there's this idea that the Second Amendment is for a certain group of people or a certain ideology of people. Can you address that a little bit and what you guys are doing as the caucus to promote that? Because I think that it scares people, and I'm not one of these people, but it scares people to have guns in the hands of Muslims, for instance.
Sure.
But is that an opportunity for us here in the state of Minnesota to bring people into the fold around this issue of defending yourself in the Second Amendment and things of that nature?
Well, I think you brought up a couple of important topics. I think the first one is the Second Amendment's for everyone. It doesn't matter your race, creed, gender, sex, religion, what have you. It protects, it's there for all citizens and others to exercise legally, regardless of any of those other characteristics. We certainly have members at the caucus that every makeup you can imagine across Minnesota. So I think to say that it's only for a certain group of people is clearly not something that I know either of us believe in. I think the issue of places of worship and security there it's a really difficult one, I think, from the standpoint that certainly different denominations and religions have different views about weapons, and they're if it's right to have them in a place like a place of worship.
Yes.
At the same time, I think we've seen, particularly in the last couple of years, targeted violence towards the Jewish community, towards the Muslim community, towards in the past it's been the Hmongs. If you go into distant history, it's been the Chinese and the Irish, and all kinds of kind of targeted violence towards specific races, specific religions in this country. Making sure that those places are safe are really a decision I think that community has to make around that facility, that place of worship. But I think it's a prudent one for them to think about what could they do to make sure that they're safe. And if that leads them down the path of armed security, then that's the right decision for them.
Now, the Gun Owners Caucus specifically, and we've had Rob Doar on a number of times from your group, you guys are down at the Capitol quite a bit, and I'm curious to get your take on what's actually happening right now within the Minnesota State Capitol as it pertains to gun legislation, and what projects are you guys working on proactively as the Gun Owners Caucus right now?
So, during the legislative session, Rob, as our political director and designated lobbyist, is there almost every day. The DFL's approach in Minnesota this year has been to focus on two bills in both the House and Senate. The bills are identical, so and there's only been movement in the House where the DFL can control the agenda right now. But House File 8 is a universal background check or universal gun registration bill. It would make the act of privately transferring or selling a firearm a crime.
Okay.
So if I wanted to sell you a gun today, and I don't, you're not a prohibited person to my knowledge, we can just make that deal. I don't have to keep records. I don't have to see your ID or anything. I know who you are. We can make that transaction.
Sure.
This bill would make that a crime, and you and I would have one of two things we would have to do. We would either have to go to a dealer and make that transfer through the normal process where you would buy from a dealer.
Yeah.
So paperwork, phone-in background check.
Taxes paid, things of that.
You would have to pay a fee.
Sure.
You'd have to pay a fee of some type, but no tax that I'm aware of. You would have to have a permit to purchase, which would be a new requirement in that transaction.
And this is for any firearm?
This will be, in the current version, this would be for handguns and for Minnesota's definition of a semi-automatic military-style assault weapon.
Okay.
Not what I would call it, but that's what the law refers
That can mean
to
a lot of, and we'll get into that, but that can mean a lot of different things.
It can mean a lot of different things. So we either have to go to a dealer and do this, and if I'm selling to you, you would need to have a permit to purchase, which is not a requirement today for us to make that transaction. And then, or we can fill out a form that the state will provide. We will put really all the same info that you're going to provide to a dealer. We will make copies for each other, and then you and I will keep those forms forever. And if you can't produce it when requested by law enforcement, no warrant, no subpoena, no court order. If you can't produce it 35 years from now, you're going to prison for a gross misdemeanor, and you'll never own firearms again.
Seriously?
Yeah. So that's the background check bill in its current form.
You know, the interesting thing about background checks in particular is it's sold as a really reasonable measure.
Sure, it takes 90 seconds.
Yeah. And beyond that, you hear polling and data and, 90 seconds, right?
Yeah, the polling,
you hear about like how 90%, which I find these numbers are ridiculous to me. You hear about how 90% of Republicans or whatever support.
But what's the poll question?
Well, I don't know.
The poll question is, do you believe that all firearm sales should require a criminal background check? That is not what the bill does.
Yeah. It's
not even close.
Right. Because that already happens to a certain extent. I know at least
firearm sale from a dealer. Absolutely. Yeah. You have to.
And even like handgun sales, I need to check in with my sheriff, to get a handgun in the state of Minnesota. I think that's crazy.
So that's House File 8.
Sure.
It's cleared 2 committees in the House. It's gone through Public Safety. It's gone through the Judiciary Committee. It's now pending action before Ways and Means. That's just because there's a fiscal component. But that's going to be a rubber stamp.
It's cleared 2 pretty big hurdles already. I mean,
so it'll go to the House floor.
It's
been a party line vote straight down the line. The House floor is going to be different. Every Republican will vote against it, and a handful of Democrats will vote against it. It'll only pass by a couple votes. I would expect that'll be an all-day, all-night debate. So it'll be the best Capitol watching we've seen in 20 years.
And it goes to the Senate.
It'll go to the Senate, and it'll sit there in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and Senator Limmer, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, will look at it and go, it's a really pretty bill sitting on my table.
I'm going to leave it there.
Not going to call it.
Yeah. Okay. So that's background checks. And then we also have the red flag
gun confiscation bill. Yeah. So
what
House
is
File
that?
9. House File 9 is a red flag bill.
8 and 9. So
8 and 9. Yeah, it's one of the top 12 priorities from the House Democrats.
Great.
House DFL. So HF 9, House File 9, is the official name is an extreme risk protective order bill, but we call it the red flag bill. That's what they called it last year.
Sounds scary.
It's really scary. What the red flag bill allows to happen is it allows law enforcement to petition the court to get an order to seize your firearms. That order is, it can be done through a process where I believe that you're a danger to yourself or others, but I don't believe that danger is imminent. So I can file for the order with the court. The court sends you a summons. We have a hearing. You get to have defense, and the judge makes a decision based upon whether or not you're a danger to yourself or others.
Seems like a really subjective.
Yeah, there's some things built into the bill, but the burden of proof is the preponderance of the evidence. That's 50% plus 1. It's a really low burden of proof to take away your constitutional right to own a firearm. That order will be for a minimum of 6 months or a maximum of 2 years, and you can appeal it once a year. Or if they think you're an imminent danger to yourself or others, which of course it'll always be an imminent danger. They'll file for an ex parte hearing, so you won't know. There'll be a hearing about you without you.
Yeah, you're not even invited to that.
Not even invited. It'll be the county attorney and the law enforcement officer that completed the affidavit and the judge. And the judge will decide again, I'm going to issue the order or not, in 6 months to 2 years, and then the police are going to show up and take your guns.
What are example situations that could be misused?
Here's a perfect one. When an anti-gun activist says, all of you people who are gun rights activists, you must be crazy. You have to be crazy to want to own guns. Or as Protect Minnesota, the anti-gun group in the state, posted a few weeks ago, when a guy showed up at a school in a Make America Great Again hat, carrying a flag and open carrying a pistol. Oh, textbook case for a red flag order.
Okay.
Is the guy crazy?
Right.
No.
It's just, I'm sure he was a law-abiding gun owner.
Mm-hmm. There's a pretty balanced story in the New York Times about 3 or 4 months ago about red flag orders, because New York has them, obviously.
Sure.
And it was about New Jersey rather, and they talked about a guy who was in his 70s who had a big gun collection. That was his hobby, and his wife died. Natural causes, just passed away at home, and medical examiners out there with an ambulance crew to take her remains away. And the guy's 77 or 78 and says, "I'm not really sure what I have to live for anymore." And that's really all that he said.
Yeah.
Yeah. Police came the next morning with a court order to seize all of his guns, and he's like, "What?"
Something I would assume
you're
many
suicidal.
people would say.
You're suicidal. It's not suicidal. I mean, I was married to this lady for 50-some years. Yeah, I'm sad that my wife died. So he went to court and was able to successfully convince the judge.
Right.
And got his firearms back.
But they in this case, and what this bill would do is they took the firearms first because it almost creates a new level of due process. It seems extra. It seems beyond.
And not only that,
our process.
but the to get the order, it's the preponderance of the evidence.
Right.
If you appeal and you have the hearing to get your guns back, is it preponderance of the evidence to get your guns back? No. It's clear and convincing evidence that you're not a danger to yourself or others.
And how?
That's a higher burden of proof.
Yeah, and in some cases, you can't. I could be a danger to myself, or you just. I don't know.
And my favorite part of the whole thing, though, is, so here, let's say we really do have someone who's suicidal, right? So we've got an individual who is clearly a danger to themselves.
Yes.
And so we're going to show up at their house. We're going to send the police to this person's house. We're going to take the firearms that they own. We're going to leave them with everything else they could use to commit suicide. Rope, carbon monoxide, car.
A roof.
Roof. Yeah, I mean, think about all the different things in your home that could be used to harm yourself. We're going to leave all of that, and we're going to leave you there with no additional mental health care.
After a bunch of brand new trauma, by having the police come and knock on your door. Prognosticating where this bill is going, do you anticipate it kind of getting through the House with the same amount of ease?
Yeah, it's going to be exactly the same. I think that we'll see. It's in the same place. It's before Ways and Means. It has a larger fiscal component to it because there's some things that need to happen to implement the bill, just with IT systems and what have you. So it'll come to the House floor. It'll pass with the same margin. There'll be a handful of DFLers that'll vote against it. All the Republicans will vote against it, and it'll go to the Senate, and it'll die.
Understanding that these are two major bills that you guys at the Gun Owners Caucus are playing defense against, are you playing offense at all, understanding the makeup of the legislature and the governor and that kind of thing? Is there anything you guys are pursuing?
Well, there's a number of bills that have been introduced that we've been involved in on the pro-gun rights side of things. And there's the same bills, House and Senate. And some of it's the things we've had before. Stand your ground for self-defense law reform. We have constitutional carry or permitless carry.
Yes.
Those are probably the two kind of biggest bills. There's constitutional amendment to add the right to keep and bear arms to Minnesota's constitution. We're one of only 7 states that don't have that in our state constitution. And then there's some things that we've worked with some authors on more recently around opportunities that we've seen as we've gone through the hearings for House File 8 and House File 9. One is that County Attorney Mike Freeman from Hennepin County told the Public Safety Committee that he doesn't prosecute misdemeanor violations of Minnesota's current background check process because he doesn't see that as a valuable use of his resources. So it's interesting, according to him, we have people who are not following the current law, but he won't prosecute them because it's a misdemeanor. So we're changing it to a felony. So maybe he'll take that seriously. And this is when you're transferring a firearm to somebody that's obviously prohibited. You know that they're prohibited and you're making the transaction anyway. So we've worked on a number of things around
that seems what I think a lot of people would consider to be reasonable, right? I mean, this is what we hear about, just looking for common sense. And and reasonable measures.
Right. Let's put people in prison that are doing things that they shouldn't be doing like this.
Mike Freeman also talked about recently how he's going to stop prosecuting minor marijuana offenses too. So
So maybe he has time now to prosecute gun crimes.
maybe.
Wow.
Who knows? It all feels political to me. Something like constitutional carry, is that a reality ever
In Minnesota? I think it's going to be really challenging. I think it's challenging because there are even Republicans that don't necessarily support that. We didn't see the bill really move much when we had the majority. We had a hearing, and that was great, but it was never voted on.
We had a slim majority, too. I mean, I think it's good to deal in reality sometimes.
Right. And we had a governor that was clearly going to veto the bill.
Sure.
So there is the question of how much political capital do you want. But I also wanted a vote on the floor because I want to know who's going to stand with that and who's going to be against it.
Yes.
No matter what party they're in.
Yes.
With my single issue hat on.
Yeah. And within that, you had also made mention about stand your ground, too. That seems like something a little bit more reasonable. Is there a real chance for that, maybe? Not necessarily in this session.
Well, I mean, it's important to note, stand your ground did pass in Minnesota in 2012, and Governor Dayton vetoed it.
Sure.
It passed when we had control of both houses. And the law that we brought back and had hearings on in 2017 was a little different than the bill that he vetoed, but the governor was pretty clear he was going to veto it again.
Okay.
And I think that probably took the wind out of the sails as it was moving through the legislature.
Sure.
But yeah, I think eventually we'll see stand your ground pass. Stand your ground's odds became much more complicated after the Trayvon Martin case because people were really kind of led down a path of misinformation and incorrect facts around how stand your ground was or wasn't used in that particular situation.
Right. Well, Bryan, with the Minnesota Gun Owners Caucus, how can people get involved with your organization and what can they do this session to help?
Sure. So the most important thing to do is to make sure that you're contacting your legislators, House and Senate, and the governor, and letting them know where you stand on the current legislation that's moving. And you can learn more about us either on Facebook as the Minnesota Gun Owners Caucus or our website, which is gunowners.mn.
It's a really easy one to remember.
We try.
Bryan Strawser, the chairman of the Minnesota Gun Owners Caucus. Thank you for joining us in the Republican Roundtable.
All right, thank you.
This has been the Republican Roundtable. I'm your host, Max Reimer. Until next time.